Cromwell's head, the death and afterlife of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658. Within weeks, he was given a state funeral. Less than 3 years later, his body had been dug up, ceremonially hung, beheaded, and his head displayed outside the Palace of Westminster. His head then passed through many hands before being buried in a Cambridge college. So what was the remarkable, if rather macabre, story behind these events? Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector in the summer of 1658, head of state of the English Republic, having survived wars, wounds, assassination plots and illness. He appeared to be at the height of his powers as his government seemed to have stabilised the country. Within weeks, though, he was dead at the age of 59. In August 1658, Cromwell's favourite daughter, Elizabeth, died of cancer, leaving him grief-stricken. Exhausted, suffering from kidney stones and one of his occasional bouts of malarial fever contracted from the fens, he declined rapidly. Oliver Cromwell died around 4 p.m. on the 3rd of September 1658 at Whitehall Palace, whilst outside one of the worst storms in living memory swept the capital. It was the anniversary of two of his greatest victories, the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Cromwell had been offered the opportunity to become king by Parliament in 1657, but had rejected the crown. It was hugely ironic, therefore, that he was effectively given a royal funeral, closely modelled on that of King James I. Funeral effigies, life-size replicas of Cromwell, along with his coffin, lay in state at Somerset House in London for the first few weeks after his death. Cromwell's body was then quietly buried in Westminster Abbey on the 10th of November, in a private ceremony for his family and close friends. It is likely that this service would have been more in accordance with his own wishes. On the 23rd of November 1658, Cromwell was given an elaborate state funeral planned over the preceding weeks. Packed crowds came out onto the streets of London to see the huge procession, which took 7 hours to move less than a mile due to its size. Thousands of soldiers lined the route, and representatives of the London guilds, the clergy, politicians, foreign diplomats, and many others formed part of the procession. This state funeral was designed to emphasise the stability of the Protectorate government. It failed. Within months, divisions between the politicians and the soldiers led to the fall of Richard Cromwell as his father's successor. Charles II was restored as monarch in April 1660. The Act of Oblivion and Indemnity, passed shortly thereafter, was designed to try and smooth over the wounds of the Civil War by giving indemnity for acts carried out during the war. There were exceptions, particularly for those involved with the trial and execution of Charles I, who were condemned as regicides. Some of the regicides fled to Europe or to the American colonies. 13 men were executed in England by the grisly method of being hanged, drawn and quartered. Others were imprisoned for life. Of the regicides listed, 24 were, like Cromwell, already dead by the time of the Restoration. On the 10th of December 1660, a royalist-dominated parliament gave orders that 4 of the leading regicides, who were already dead, should be exhumed and their bodies given a post-mortem execution. These were John Bradshaw, President of the Court at King Charles's trial, Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law and one of those behind the trial of the king, and Thomas Pride, whose military coup in December 1648, known as Pride's Purge, cleared more moderate MPs for Parliament and enabling the trial of the king. Pride's body could not be located, but Cromwell, Bradshaw and Ireton's bodies were taken from Westminster Abbey to Tyburn, the traditional place of execution for common criminals in London. On the 30th of January 1661, the anniversary of Charles I's death, 3 men's bodies were hung in front of jeering crowds. After several hours, the bodies were cut down and their heads hacked off. Cromwell's head took at least 8 cuts. Their bodies were thrown into the communal burial pit for felons below the gallows. The men's severed heads were then impaled on oak poles that were then mounted on the south side of Westminster Hall, the building part of the Palace of Westminster which still stands today, in which Charles I's trial had taken place. The undignified execution, though, was not the end of the story for Cromwell's head. The head remained on display on its wooden stake until the 1680s, when the stake snapped off below the head during a violent storm. The mummified head on its spike was allegedly picked up by a soldier on guard duty who took it home, but fearful of being caught with it, hid it up his chimney. By 1710, the head was in the collection of a Swiss entrepreneur, Claudius Dupuy, who exhibited as part of a private museum in London, a collection of curiosities which was an early tourist attraction. After Dupuy's death in 1738, the head next surfaced in the 1770s in the ownership of an alcoholic comic actor called James Russell. Russell was persuaded to sell the head to James Cox in 1787 for the sum of £118, roughly £10,000 in today's money, which Cox bought as an investment. The investment paid off, as Cox more than made his money back in 1799 when he sold the head to the Hughes brothers for £230. They planned to use a resurgence of interest in Cromwell, caused by the revolution in France, to launch an exhibition about him in London, bringing in the antiquarian and artist John Cranch to help them. The plan flopped, due to doubts at that time about the head's authenticity and increasing public distaste about exhibiting human remains for entertainment. In 1815, the Hughes family sold the head to the Wilkinson family, who then kept it for the next 145 years. Cromwell's head was kept in a wooden box on a mantelpiece and brought out to show curious visitors and entertain people at dinner parties. In 1935, Horace Wilkinson, a canon in the Church of England, allowed the head to be analysed by two sceptical scientists, Carl Pearson and Geoffrey Morant, who subjected it to all the scientific tests that they could muster. They compared it to the death masks and portraits, x-rayed and photographed it, and compared it forensically to the descriptions of what had been done to Cromwell's corpse in 1661. Despite their scepticism, two men concluded that it was a moral certainty that the head was genuinely that of Oliver Cromwell. In 1960, the then owner, Dr. Horace Wilkinson, gave the head to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, part of the University of Cambridge, where Cromwell had been an undergraduate. It was interred in a secret location in the chapel of the college, although there is a commemorative plaque nearby. Sidney Sussex College tell us that when it was buried there, they decided to put it in an airtight container in order to preserve it for future generations. The only one that could be found to accommodate the head, the spike it was on, and the wooden box it was contained in, was an old-fashioned catering-sized tin of biscuits. So yes, Cromwell's head is buried in a biscuit tin. However, like many aspects of Cromwell's life, legends have sprung up about his death, and most particularly the location of the rest of his body. Some people have suggested that the body hung at Tyburn in January 1661 wasn't actually that of Oliver Cromwell, that his body was smuggled away and replaced. However, given that the corpse that was posthumously executed was recognised by eyewitnesses, and that the head in Cambridge is almost certainly his, this would seem to be rather unlikely. Other people have suggested that his decapitated body was removed from Tyburn and buried elsewhere. Locations for this have included Newborough Priory in North Yorkshire, owned by the descendants of a daughter of Cromwell's, Northborough Church near Peterborough, the burial place of Cromwell's widow Elizabeth, Naseby Battlefield in Northamptonshire, the site of one of Cromwell's great victories, and St Nicholas's Church at Chiswick in London, where it is alleged that he was buried with two of his daughters. No concrete evidence has ever been found to support these stories, and given that they usually have unaccountable gaps of years or even decades between Cromwell's execution and an alleged burial, they seem rather unlikely. Almost certainly Cromwell's headless body lies today in the vicinity of Tyburn, where it was thrown into the felon's burial pit after his post-mortem execution. Today, that's just across the road from Marble Arch in London. If you'd like to know more about the grimly fascinating story of Oliver Cromwell's death, funeral, post-mortem execution, and the adventures of his head, then you can come and visit the exhibition that now runs at the Cromwell Museum until the 30th of March 2025. The exhibition includes remarkable objects from the museum's collections, including one of the few surviving banners displayed at Cromwell's funeral, one of his death masks, and also rarely seen items from the archives at Sidney Sussex College, including a rather grisly portrait of Cromwell's head and the key to the wooden box inside which for over 150 years Cromwell's head was actually kept.